Our Old Testament lesson is from the book of Genesis, chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the trees. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as quickly as you have said, or do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I've grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, since it's Father's Day, I think it's appropriate to honor Father's Day by beginning with a dad joke. I was going to say by beginning with a bad dad joke, but that'd sort of be redundant, wouldn't it? Actually, dictionary.com had a competition just recently to try and come up with the very worst or best dad joke, and they invited all their readers to finish a line that they had started to make a dad joke. And the line was, based on the old joke, "Why did the chicken cross the road?" The line was, "Why did the dictionary cross the road?" And they got like over 10,000 answers, 10,000 new answers to make up this joke, and then they decided on which one was the best. But here were some of my favorites. Why did the dictionary cross the road? To get its meaning across. Yeah. I hope the groans get louder as we go along, but feel free to do this. Why did the dictionary cross the road? Because it didn't want to be stationary. Yeah, that's a pretty good one, isn't it? Why did the dictionary cross the road? To get the synonym bun. Not the synonym bun. All right. Now here's the winner that they selected. I know you're sitting on the edge of your pews waiting for this, but here's the winner that they selected. Why did the dictionary cross the road? To visit its grandma. Yeah, I know. I would have chosen a different one too for the best one, but that's the one they selected. Go figure. The Lord said to Abraham, "Why is Sarah laughing?" And Abraham said, "I don't know. She never laughs at any of my dad jokes. I said to Sarah just the other day, 'Hey, Sarah, my uncle works for the bicycle company. He's the spokesman.' No reaction at all. And now you say that Sarah's going to have a baby and she's back there laughing her head off. What sort of joke is that really in the first place?" It might be good for us to catch up, just try and quickly catch up on where Abraham and Sarah have been. I know Helen related much of that story to the children during her children's time, but he was 75 years old when he and Abram and Sarai and their nephew Lot heard the call from God. Abraham did, and they took off for Canaan. And when they got there, The Lord said to Abraham, all of this land, I'm going to give it to you and to your offspring. But as we know, they didn't have any offspring. They had no children. And so Abram pitched his tent there at Bethel, and he built an altar for the Lord. And it wasn't before long that the land was hit by famine, and so then they had to go down to Egypt. And when they were down in Egypt, that's when Abram said to Sarai, his wife, now just tell Pharaoh you're my sister. Because if they find out you're my wife, they might kill me. So just go along with this and tell. And she did. But then when Pharaoh found out about the lie and how he'd been fooled, he sent them packing to go back up north, but not after he had given them lots of livestock, camels, and lots of gold and silver. Well, they made their way back up north to Canaan, this time to Bethel, and Abraham again built an altar to the Lord there. And then he and Lot divided up all this land that they were looking at. Lot went off to the east, and Abraham stayed there nearer the coast. And again, God came to Abraham and said to Abraham, this land, all of it's going to belong to you. I'm going to give it to you and your offspring forever. And Abraham got up then at this point and moved his tent again. Always seems to be moving, but this time he moves his tent to Hebron, to this place by the oaks of Mamre, and he builds another altar to God there. And after a while, he gets news that Lot has been captured back down south in Sodom, so he has to go down there to Sodom and rescue Lot and bring him back up to Canaan again. And you remember shortly after that, that's when this mysterious figure of Melchizedek, the king, appears to Abraham, and Abraham offers him a tithe. But they get back finally to Hebron, Abraham and Lot and all of the family, and God appears to Abraham in a vision again and says, don't be afraid, Abram, I am your shield and your reward is going to be great. But this time Abraham does say, he says, wait a minute, I don't have any children. How is it that I'm going to be great? And that's when, for the first time, God takes Abram outside of the tent and says, look, you're going to have more offspring than there are dust and all the earth. That's how many offspring you're going to have. And at this point, that's when we're told in a very famous verse that Abram believed the Lord, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. But still, Abram and Sarah didn't have any children. And that's when Sarah started to get a little anxious about things, and so she devised her own plan, and she talked Abram into having a child with her Egyptian slave, Hagar. But as soon as Hagar had her child, Sarah got mean as a snake and chased Hagar off into the wilderness. But an angel of the Lord came to Hagar and found her there and made her return and go back to Sarah, promising that she and her child, her son Ishmael, would be parents of a great nation as well. At that point, Abram was 86. He was 86 when Hagar gave birth to his son Ishmael. When Abram was 99, the Lord appeared to him again and said again, I'm going to make my covenant with you. I'm going to keep this promise, and you're going to be exceedingly numerous. And it's at this point that God changed their names from Abram to Abraham and from Sarai to Sarah. And God said, once again, I'm making an everlasting covenant with you. You're going to be exceedingly fruitful, and your offspring will possess the land forever. You and Sarah will have a son. And now at this point, Abraham falls on his face laughing, and he says to God, how in the world can someone who's 100 years old have a baby? And how in the world can Sarah, when she's 90 years old, have a baby? Look, God, I already have a son, Ishmael. Let's just fulfill this promise through Ishmael. And God says, no, not at all. You and Sarah are going to have a son, and I'm going to name him Isaac. And it's through Isaac and his lineage that I will keep and establish my covenant and be faithful to you. I don't know if you've ever noticed in this long story, but God never appeared to Sarah throughout all this. God never appeared to Sarah to tell her about this promise that he had made with Abram and how they were going to have a son. And I can't tell that Abram ever really told Sarah about this promise that God had made to him, and kind of keeps driving them from one place to the other. And I've been wondering how it is that Abraham could just forget this detail. Forget something like that to tell Sarah. It's pretty clear that Sarah is sure that she's barren, and that's why she comes up with this plan to take things into her own hands and for Hagar to bear Abraham a son. And I'm kind of wondering maybe if that's the scenario, Abram still pondering these things, with Sarah not really being in the know yet. Maybe that's sort of the situation when we get to the passage, which I just read from chapter 18. And I wonder if Abram is just sitting there by the flaps of his tent out by the oaks of Mamre, trying to keep his cool in the heat of the day and wondering to himself, okay, now how at this point, I'm 100, Sarah is 90, how at this point could God possibly give us a son? But even more, how at this point can I bear to break the news to Sarah? Don't you think she'd say to him, and you forgot to tell me this for the past 15 years, and we've been moving from one place to the other, and you forgot to tell me this? I went to see Helen Potter in the hospital the week before last. You know, she's 107. She's going to be 108 this coming July. She's remarkable, the clarity of her mind and her interest. She filled me in on all the details of what the doctors were saying and doing, and she wanted to talk to me about current events going on in the world, events she had read about in the newspaper and was concerned about. She was worried about the state of the world and the war in Ukraine. And I was just amazed at how knowledgeable she was on everything. And she even commented to me, you know, I think there's some people at church that are beginning to show their age, don't you? Could be. You can kind of say those things when you're 107. Clear how remarkably clear her mind was. But she never said it to me. She never said anything about you know, having a baby. And I got to thinking, you know, if I had suggested to Helen, just to making conversation, Helen Potter, you know, Helen, Abraham and Sarah had a baby when they were 100 and she was 90, I wonder if she would have thought that was a joke. I wonder if she would have laughed. I'm not sure, but I bet she would have called the nurses to have me removed from the room at that point. Some things you just don't joke around about. They're not always so funny. I went and led devotions at Westminster Towers this past week, and we were looking at this same passage, and I began by saying, let's just take a little survey. I want to see how old some of you were when you had children. And so I said, anybody here who had children in their 30s, raise their hand. Everybody did. Anybody here had children in their 40s? Many raised their hand. Okay. Anybody here had children in the 50s? Nobody raised their hand. But then I got to, anybody here with children in their 60s? And a few people raised their hand. I thought, wow, this is you. Anybody here in the 70s? And one lady raised her hand, waving over there. You know, and I just couldn't believe it. And I thought, and I turned to her and said, you had a child when you were 70? And then you could see the light bulb went off in her head, and the light bulb went off in my head. I had just misphrased it. They thought I was saying, did any of you have children that were that old in their 70s? Not, did you have a child when you were 70? And as soon as we cleared that up, everybody started to laugh and got the joke and was in on the joke. It's right at this point in the story. It's right here that we're told, once again, that the Lord appears to Abram. He looks up and he sees three men by his tent. He sensed that there was something propitious about the moment. He jumps up and he's immediately deferential to them. He bows down and he implores them, don't go, stay and let me get you some water and get you something to eat. Give me the honor of helping you to rest and refresh yourselves before you leave. And the men replied, yes, of course, you can do that. So Abram jumps up and he jumps into action and he runs into his tent and he orders Sarah to make cakes and he runs to the herd and he chooses a calf and he gives it to the servants to prepare and he puts down this hearty meal before the three visitors, before the three guests, and they sit down to eat. Now, have you ever asked yourselves, who are these three men? Who are these three men that just show up while Abraham is there by the tent? The text doesn't give us a direct answer. It begins by saying the Lord appeared to Abraham. And then suddenly the three men are there by the tent. They eat the meal that Abraham has prepared for them, and then they ask him, where's Sarah? Where's Sarah? She's inside the tent. And then one of these men speaks again the promise of God to Abraham. When it's the right time, he says, I will return and Sarah will have a son. Apparently, Sarah's just been eavesdropping on the conversation, and this is when she finally hears this promise of God that she can't stop herself from just laughing out loud. It's the laugh that I bet you know. It's the laugh of incredulity. It's the laugh of disbelief. It's the laugh that you laugh when you hear something that's so outlandish and so preposterous that you bypass anger and rebuke and just go right to laughing about it. And such laughter is usually followed by saying something like, you can't really be serious. It's the kind of laugh you get when a joke is so silly that even though the joke may be about you, you're not really offended by it because it speaks of something so unbelievable that there's no real risk you will believe it, and your only choice is just sort of to find it humorous. That's exactly what Sarah does. Yeah, right. He's 100 and I'm 90, and suddenly it's going to be like Richard Gere and Julia Roberts and Pretty Woman? Be serious. And it's that point that Sarah names, I think, the real problem that we may have with God's promise. If this promise depends on us, on our ability, our resources, our creativity, our diligence, our faithfulness, if that's what the promise depends on, then it's a pretty empty promise. And from Sarah's perspective, she can't see it any other way, and there's nothing to do except laugh about it. Because what is possible is determined by the reality of life as we have it. And so you laugh. But it's right at this point when Sarah laughs, this laugh of disbelief, of incredulity, of, come on, let's be serious. It's right at this point when Sarah laughs that the text shifts from three men speaking to the Lord speaking again. The Lord now says to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? And he asks, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? I think it's almost like Sarah's laughter prompts God's direct challenge. Can we be open to the possibility that God can act and create in the world independently of the circumstances and conditions that we believe wholeheartedly constrain us? Could it be possible? Can we believe it that God can act in the world beyond our ideas and certainties of what we think is possible? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Is God free to act in the power of his love and goodness in ways that don't depend on us? Can God's will and purpose bring forth something in our lives beyond the limits of what we think is possible for us to do? The truth asserted in this story, the truth that God is free in love and power to create and give goodness, blessing, mercy, grace, justice, and peace, that truth is the foundation of our faith and trust. And that truth is the center of the Bible's message from beginning to end. And the proclamation that God chooses to give such goodness and love to us, that proclamation, exactly at the point where we refuse to love and trust God, that's the very heart of the gospel. That's what God does in Jesus Christ. It's not the same thing as saying, anything is possible that we can imagine. It's not the same thing as saying anything is possible if we pray hard enough for it. It's not the same thing as saying anything is possible if we just really, really, really wish for it. It is saying that God can create relationship with us. God can be our God and shape us into God's people, even when we do everything we can imagine to break the relationship. God can fulfill God's promise through us, even when we can't believe that it's possible for us to bear the promise. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. Know and remember that the Lord is our God. It is he that made us, and we are his. And therefore, trusting in what God can do, we enter into God's presence, into God's gates, with thanksgiving, singing songs of praise. Sarah laughed, Abraham laughed, and you and I, we would have laughed too. Because we get used to thinking about our lives strictly in terms of what we think is possible or likely or even easy for us to do on most days. We get worn down by disappointments and frustrations, by constant worries and real difficulties that we face daily. And it's easy to live with this certainty that this is just how life goes. This is the best that we can expect, and so we should not expect any more from ourselves than to do the best you can and accept what you can't really change. That's the serenity prayer, isn't it? You all know the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's a wonderful prayer. It has been a help to so many people, especially when we get caught living with a distorted view of who we think we are and what we think we can do. But what happens when you pray that prayer? Maybe like Abraham, maybe like Sarah. What happens when you pray that prayer for some sense of serenity? What happens when God answers the prayer by saying, is there anything too wonderful for the Lord? What happens when God answers our prayer by shifting the focus from us to God? What happens when God promises, I will give you the faith to accept the things I can change? Or when God says, I will give you the courage to trust that I can do what you can't do. Or when God says, I will give you the wisdom to believe and to live as though I can make a difference. Is there anything too wonderful for the Lord? Andrew Root has a new book. He teaches at Luther Seminary in Minnesota, and he has a new book titled When the Church Stops Working. When Church Stops Working. And he explores a lot of the difficulties that the church is facing these days, and sometimes the sense that we all begin to feel that it's just not working like it used to. What are we going to do about it? And in one of his chapters titled, Forget the Mission Statement, Get a Watchword, Andrew Root talks about the difference between doing everything we can, using all of our powers and our resources to determine what actions are best for us to undertake, for us to try and continue to remain relevant and important and meaningful in the midst of all the change going on around us. We want to make some kind of statement of what we aspire to do, what we commit ourselves to do, what we believe we can do. Root says we deeply are shaped by the idea that we all have to have a mission statement. We all have to have a purpose before us, something that we've decided is within the possibility that we can undertake. And he suggests that rather than basing everything on the determination of what we think we can do, we begin to try and get a watchword, a gift from God that says, no, I need you to look at the world not from the perspective of what you think you can do, But I need you to look at the world and engage in life in the ways that you find me encountering you, in the ways that you find me coming to you, assisting you, helping you, providing for you, strengthening you, calling you. Get a watchword. Get a phrase, get a message which God speaks that challenges you and asks you to look at the world from God's perspective. Maybe that watchword is anything too wonderful for the Lord? What about your day would change if you just started to leave from here and look at things and think about things and mull about things with that phrase, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? He goes on to tell the story about a Lutheran church in Minnesota, Prince of Peace Lutheran Church, that called a young pastor there to be their associate pastor, and his job was to revamp the whole educational program of the church and bring to it the latest techniques and ideas and things that we could do to kind of shore things up and boost Sunday school attendance and make everything like it used to be. And that young pastor got there and he began to do all these things that he had been taught to do, and he said things were going along pretty well, except he kept running up against this one Sunday school class and the two adult leaders in that class, an older couple, Marge and Jean Jurgensen, and they just never seemed to be getting with the program that he was setting before everybody to get things to be right. They never seemed to be following the right lesson plans. They never seemed to be using the curriculum that he set before them, and he was bothered by it, except that he said all of the seventh graders loved to be a part of their class. And when he would go, he'd see the seventh graders huddled around the Jurgensens. Sometimes they'd even crawl under the table. It looked like they were having class there. He went by one time, and the class wasn't even in their room. They were off in the boiler room of the sanctuary having class down there. And finally, he went to them and said, "Marge and Jean, what's going on with you in your teaching? What are you doing?" And they both acted sort of embarrassed, and they said, "Oh, we know we're not really very good teachers, and we're not following all the instructions that you give us, and we really only have one thing that we just keep teaching all the kids over and over again. And the phrase we keep teaching is that nothing can separate you from God's love. That's the only message we have for them, and we just keep giving this message to them in different ways, and we call each of them on their birthdays and remind them, nothing can separate from you from God's love. Even when they're not in the class anymore, when they graduate from college, we call and say on their birthday, nothing can separate from you God's love. And when they get old and get ready to get married, we call them and say, nothing can separate you from God's love." And the young pastor said, No, I'm not angry with you. I really am trying to understand, and now I'm beginning to see why this is working. Why these seventh graders love you. Why they want to be a part of this. Why they're huddled together with you, waiting to hear this. And they began to sense that this was a phrase that was at work throughout the whole church. Nothing can separate us from God's love. And they took a little banner that Marge had stitched that phrase onto, nothing can separate us from God's love, and put it in front of the church, and they all kind of enjoyed it being there. And as they did that and began to coalesce around that more and more, this young pastor learned a story about Marge and Jean, how many, many years ago they had a son, and shortly after he was born, they learned that he was hearing impaired and deaf, but they loved him and they nurtured him, and they did everything for him. They became so fluent in sign language. They began to teach him in sign language over and over again this phrase, nothing can separate you from God's love. And he grew older and graduated from high school and met a beautiful young woman and got married. And then tragically, just shortly after he was married, became ill and died suddenly. And it literally destroyed their lives. And Marge and Jean said, we didn't know how we could possibly make it through. And other students from the class that we had been teaching across the years began to come to us and say, nothing can separate you from God's love. And the church began to gather around us and say, nothing can separate you from God's love. And it's what held us together, they said. And it's what's become the very foundation of our faith and our trust and what we want more than anything else to share with these young people now. Nothing can separate you from God's love. A gift an encounter with God at work in their lives, healing and holding them together. A promise of what is possible. Not possible on the basis of who you are, but possible on the basis of who God is. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Why are you laughing? Amen.